Welcome. Today, the sad and shocking case of Kalief Browder, the 16-year-old who spent 33 months in jail on Rikers Island, some 800 days of it in solitary confinement for allegedly stealing a backpack. In all that time, no trial and sometimes no food. His story offers a lesson in crime and punishment, New York style. Also on the program, a high-tech tool to spread democracy through the Big Apple, the online petition. How come the mayor won't sign on? And in our public intellectual segment, venture capital bias. A new study details how women entrepreneurs get shortchanged. All that plus the murals of East Harlem, preserved from gentrification in photographs. First, though, a window into the justice system. On a given day, there are roughly 11,000 prisoners locked up on Rikers Island in the 10 jails there, including one holding 600 or so teenagers. This high school student from the Bronx, Kalief Browder, became one of those prisoners back in 2010. The system took almost 3 years of his freedom and nearly his life. How did that happen? And how much of an exception is Kalief's story? The answers are in the October 6th New Yorker in an article written by Jennifer Gonnerman entitled "Before the Law, a 16-year-old boy's ordeal in Rikers." Gonnerman has long chronicled problems with the justice system, including a book about another case, Life on the Outside, the Prison Odyssey of Elaine Bartlett. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thanks so much for having me.
What happened on Arthur Avenue, Restaurant Row in the Bronx, May 15th, 2010?
So this story starts late one night, spring of 2010. Kalief Browder and a friend are walking home from a party, and a police car pulls up. At first they don't think anything of it. Officer gets out and accuses them of a robbery, of robbing somebody. He says, "There's a man in the back of my police cruiser who says that you robbed him." And they insist they did nothing wrong, and the conversation goes on. More police cars show up. Ultimately, they end up being taken into custody. It's unclear whether the robbery happened a week ago, 2 weeks ago. The details are fuzzy, and Kalief thinks, well, I did nothing wrong. This will all be cleared up in a couple of hours. I'll go home. No, he ends up spending 3 years, as you said, on Rikers Island.
Isn't there a law in New York that gives someone the right to a speedy trial, even if he is falsely charged?
Right. Well, there is a law. It's actually, New York's version of the speedy trial law is called the Ready Rule, and it means that the prosecutors must be ready to try the case within 6 months of arraignment. But 6 months isn't quite 6 months in the court system. Time ends up moving in a couple of different ways. There's Kalief's life, where every day counts as a day, but in the court system, it's a little bit complicated, but basically there are exceptions to the 6 months. So the clock stops when they file pretrial motions. It can stop at other points. So ultimately, he can spend months and months in jail, which may only shave a few days off the speedy trial clock.
Are there delays on purpose to pressure prisoners to plea?
Well, that's a very, very good question. And it is, Kalief Browder has a civil case against the city in the wake of his incarceration, and that's one of the accusations that his lawyer makes in the case, that he accuses the prosecutor's office of dragging out the case with needless delays as a way to try to squeeze him for a plea deal. What
percentage of the prisoners at Rikers do wait more than 6 months of real time for a trial?
I don't know that number off the top of my head.
I've seen 75%.
Yeah, I don't think all of those folks are actually on Rikers Island, but in the Bronx in 2011, I think it was 74% of felony cases were more than 6 months old. Many of those people are obviously confined on Rikers, though not all.
Do most have bail?
Well, I don't have the exact bail numbers at my fingertips, but, obviously the Bronx is a very poor county. Many people are locked up with bails that they can't afford, but bails that in another part of the country might seem like nothing, $500, $1,000, $2,000.
Mayor de Blasio recently outlawed solitary confinement for juveniles, I guess 16 and 17-year-olds, who could have been subject to it, in many cases were subject to it at Rikers. Mm-hmm. Was that an issue in this case?
It certainly was. Kalief Browder was locked up for more than 1,000 days on Rikers Island, and about 2 years or so of those 3 years he was there, he spent in solitary confinement. Now that might seem extraordinary, but at the same time, New York City has until recently been sort of increasingly relying on solitary confinement as a management tool on Rikers Island. About a year ago, a report came out that said 27% of adolescents on Rikers were in solitary. And he was one of those before he was released last year. So This news that the commissioner is going to be ending solitary confinement for 16 and 17-year-olds is obviously very welcome news, but you know, it's going to be a real challenge for them to undo that. They've relied on solitary as a very serious management tool to deal with inmates for many years now.
He asked for solitary at one point?
I don't think he asked for it. His brother, when he went in, counseled him and said, you know, if he was in the adolescent jail on Rikers Island. It's called the Robert N. DeVoren Center, and has become notorious, especially in recent months, because the U.S. Attorney has put out a report back in August, 79 pages of the most horrifying details about what goes on or what has gone on with adolescents in that jail, inmate-on-inmate violence, officers attacking inmates. He was in that jail. His brother told him, if the situation seems too much for you to handle, if it's too frightening, if you feel like your life's in danger or you feel like you're going to be attacked, put yourself in solitary. So Kalief had that in the back of his mind, but you know, it wasn't really intentional that he ended up in solitary or doing that much time. One thing that did happen to him when he would end up in solitary, and this is also not uncommon, is that he'd go in on one charge and then end up collecting more charges while he was there and extending his stay, which an expert, somebody who used to work on Rikers, explained to me is a pretty common phenomenon.
How do you get more charges in solitary?
Covering up your cell window, add some more days. You know, things where you get into kind of disputes with the officers, and maybe there's like a, you know, maybe there's like a grievance, and then it gets played out through the sort of punishment process, which they call infractions on Rikers Island.
Do they get enough food in solitary?
Well, you know, all I know is what Kalief's telling me and what other reports have put out. Kalief, when you're in solitary confinement, you get 3 meals a day coming through the slot in the door. A tray comes through the slot in the door. Kalief told me the minute he finished breakfast, he's thinking about lunch. The minute he eats lunch, he's thinking about dinner. The 12 hours from dinner to breakfast were the hardest time of the day, and then he's drinking a lot of water out of the sink to try to fill his stomach so that he can calm his stomach enough to sleep. And when he told me this story months ago, I thought, you know, how common is that? That's pretty extreme. Not that long ago, with Bronx defenders to put a report out, and they have made many trips out to Rikers Island to interview their clients who are in solitary, and they said that that's a not uncommon experience, and that it's particularly acute among teenage boys, which would make sense. They're growing, they need more food, and you know, this small amount that's coming through the slot in the door doesn't seem to be enough.
They would withhold food as a punishment?
Well, that's a slightly different question, and that's something that Kalief has said happened to him on some occasions, and it's contained in his lawsuit. He alleges that there were sometimes part of the punishment was for him in particular, if he got into a dispute with an officer, that they might skip a meal on him.
So years of delays on a charge that, never mind that he apparently didn't do it, I guess, as came out later, that was minor. Did his lawyers fail him? You
know, he had one lawyer, what we call an 18B lawyer, a court-appointed lawyer, who's, of course, swimming in cases, as these lawyers invariably are, being paid $75 an hour for a felony case. He never visited his client on Rikers.
He never had a face-to-face with his lawyer?
Well, he had a face-to-face sort of behind the courtroom in a kind of hurried setting. What a lot of, you know, in his defense, a lot of 18B lawyers never make a trip out to Rikers to see their client. It eats up about half a day. It's it's incredibly time-consuming. So in the Bronx, what they do is they've got video conferences from the courthouse where a lawyer can sit down with their client. You know, it's not as good as face-to-face, but it's something. And when I asked the lawyer if he'd ever done that with his client, he said he was pretty sure he had, but when I asked Kalief, he said it never happened. So there was obviously not a lot of communication happening there.
He was offered a plea deal on time served and could have walked away at a certain point and didn't. Is that correct?
Yeah, he had done almost 3 years. He's standing in court. The judge offers him, if you plead to 2 misdemeanors, you can basically leave today. You can leave right now. And this is in the spring of 2013. And he actually stood there and he said, I think the direct quote was, "I'm all right. I didn't do it, I'm all right." I mean, at that point, he clearly was not all right. He attempted suicide several times on Rikers. And the judge says to him, "You're all right?" And he says, "I want to go to trial." So it's the same thing he'd been saying for 3 years. You know, just like he thought his case was going to be resolved quickly, he didn't understand that very few cases go to trial in the Bronx, and that's why he basically sat there for 3 years waiting for a trial that ultimately never even happened.
Never even happened?
So what happened at the next court date is I don't think it was the next court date, it was a couple down the road, but there's a trial date set and the trial never happened. And when the prosecutors came in, they basically said there's not enough evidence to prosecute him because the witness had disappeared, had gone back to Mexico. They couldn't find him. They couldn't bring him back. And without the witness, they didn't have a case. So they basically just let him walk away. So you have this kid who went into the system at 16, and he had just turned 20. He's standing there in court, finding out that he can go home, which of course he's very happy to hear, but he's sort of stunned because what were those 3 years for? You know, it's the junior year of high school, the senior year of high school, 1 year after that. And what did it all mean? 3 years of his life for nothing, for a case dismissed.
Did he have bail?
Initially, bail was set at $3,000, but quickly after that, what's called a violation of probation was filed on him. He was on probation in a prior case for which he had been adjudicated as a youthful offender, and the case was going to be, you know, sealed, but he was still on probation at the time he was arrested. They drop a violation of probation on him. The judge remands him, which means there is no bail. So for most of the life of the case, there was no bail. So it wasn't, even if his family could come up with the money, they couldn't bail him out.
From age 16 to 20.
Right.
He was at Rikers.
Right, that's right.
What was the effect on his mental health, do you know?
You know, I'm not a psychologist, but when I met him earlier this year, you could still, I thought, see the traces of not just the long confinement, but all those months in solitary. He seemed just kind of not used to being around people. His brother told me he would, you know, call him up and invite him to the movies or to go out and do things, and Kalief would say, "Nah, I don't do that. You know, I don't do that." And he'd rather sort of stay home in his room, shut the door, and he felt more comfortable doing that, kind of closing himself off from the world. And it was almost as if he were recreating the conditions of solitary on the outside. So even though he was free, he didn't really seem to feel free in his mind.
Did you write about Kalief because he's such an outlier, such an exception, or because he's representative of the system and how people get treated?
You know, Kalief is actually both. I mean, his case is extreme. He is something of an outlier. He's not the only one who's gone through this kind of experience. But at the same time, his case, partly what drew me to it is that it's so many of the institutional failings of our system are illustrated through his case, whether it's, as you mentioned, sort of the type of representation that poor people get with court-appointed attorneys or 18B attorneys, to questions about bail, questions about speedy trial, or are there any speedy trials, conditions on Rikers, conditions in solitary, and the after effects of all of that.
And now he's brought lawsuits against the city and the Bronx DA?
He's got one lawsuit against the city, the police, the Bronx DA, and the corrections, the jail system.
And what is he looking to get, and do you think he'll get it?
You know, they're obviously asking for some money. I have no idea how that suit's going to play out. It's still in the very early stages. You know, but he said to me at one point when I interviewed him not that long ago, you know, he said, people tell me I'm going to be okay because I've got this suit against the city and maybe I'll get some money, but at the end of the day, I'm mentally scarred. You know, I feel like I've been changed and I'm not sure I'm going to change back. And I think that's what really haunts him more than anything.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.
You might have come across this website, We the People. It's the White House's virtual open door where citizens can start and sign petitions. Well, a few city council people would like something similar here in New York City, set up so that once a certain number of people sign a petition, a city agency or public authority must respond. But Petition NYC, as it's called, has yet to pass City Council. The de Blasio administration has testified against it, too. So what's so controversial about an online petition site? Well, Gotham Gazette reporter Kristen Merriweather has been covering the story, and she joins us now. Welcome.
Thank you.
Tell us more. What is Petition NYC?
Well, Petition NYC is very similar to, as you said, the We the People petition platform, which is done on the federal level. Basically, if you have something that you want to petition your government either for or against, you can just go online and create a petition and get your neighbors to sign on. And there's a threshold. Once they hit that threshold, you would force the administration to issue a response.
What's the threshold at the federal level?
The federal level, it just changed this year. It's 100,000 in 30 days, which is kind of a lot. It used to be 25,000, and they changed it
To 100,000 in 30 days. So
yes.
If you're MoveOn.org or something like that, you can maybe generate a lot of petition signatures, but a regular person would have to have a lot of neighbors.
Yes, you would definitely have to have some sort of movement, whether it's be social media or some sort of neighborhood thing. I don't know. It would definitely take a lot of work to get 100,000.
And how would it work in New York?
Well, in New York, they haven't set the threshold yet, but I would assume it would be something similar to you could use social media, or just simple, your neighborhood interaction, some sort of small neighborhood group. There really hasn't been since it hasn't passed, there hasn't been a lot of rules.
Or is there a specific proposal for a certain number of signatures that would generate a required response?
Not yet. Do It, which is the Department of Information Technology and Telecommunication, would be the one who would set the threshold. And that threshold has not been set yet.
Mayor de Blasio is against this. This doesn't sound like what I would think of as him.
Yeah, I was a little taken aback that he was against this as well, but they came out very firmly against it. They said, I pulled the quote here, it says, in 2014, a government-sponsored petition tool is a waning model in the age of direct engagement. So they kind of had an issue with that, using that being a tool for direct engagement.
Government-sponsored because this is a city council bill?
Yes, so government-sponsored versus something like Ask Them or any other nonprofit run site.
But it would have to be passed by the government in some way in order to create a mandatory response, right?
Well, the sites like Ask Them, I guess it wouldn't be a mandatory response, but what they're trying to do is get these government figures to sign on, and so no, it's not a mandatory response, but it would be a nice thing to do.
Right. Do you know who the city council members are who introduced the bill, by any chance?
Councilmember Vaca is the one who introduced the bill, and it's sponsored by, at this point, Peter Koo and Annabelle Palma. Those are the only two other sponsors, at least at the hearing.
And others aren't piling on. Where's our progressive speaker? Where's Brad Lander and the rest of the progressive caucus?
I was actually very surprised that there was nobody, none of the usual players, I should say, at that particular council hearing. I know there was a couple different activities going on that day, so that may have just been why. But I have not seen any other activity in support of that.
What are they afraid of?
That I'm not sure. I can't speak to the motives of the other council members. I know Councilmember Ben Kalos, who's typically supportive of these kind of measures, would probably sign on. I don't know if there's any particular reason that he hasn't, but this is definitely in his wheelhouse and something that he is generally speaking support of.
So what went wrong at the federal level that maybe it wasn't a good model for this? Because We the People hasn't been a perfect model, right?
It has not been a perfect model. I think the big issue is how do you, in order to make these kinds of sites successful, you've seen change.org and moveon.org use just generally good marketing. They've emailed their petitions out, said, hey, you signed this petition, this is something similar, perhaps you should do this. Social media, hey, this is a new petition today. And those are the kind of things that it's kind of questionable whether government actually has a role in doing those kind of things. So We the People has taken more of a passive marketing stance, and it has not been as successful.
There's a petition for government to build a Death Star like in Star Wars. Is that a particularly bad example?
It depends on what a bad example of. I think it was a great example of using an interesting thing that everybody knows and probably thought was funny. It drew a lot of media attention, and in that case, it drew a lot of people to the site. But it is an example of kind of one of those maybe not so useful petitions. But you do need that kind of marketing spark to really get people to the site.
Is it fair to say that We the People is a failure?
Oh, that's a tough one. I would not necessarily say it's a failure because there are people on there, but it definitely could be, there are ways to improve its interaction and getting more people to sign up. But again, you kind of go into that question of, is that government's role?
What did Jessica Singleton mean by one-on-one dialogue?
She was talking more about, they kind of gave a list in their testimony of like different things. A lot of social media engagement. You can now actually use Twitter to make complaints, kind of similar to 311, but you can use Twitter, which is kind of interesting. As well as, you can email the mayor, and supposedly you can get a response from them. Those are kind of the direct one-on-one engagement that she was talking about, and they were thinking is better than this kind of model.
And that would be a direct response on Twitter, that is to an individual, as opposed to a public tweet?
So, supposedly, yeah. And so what they'll do is they'll take that tweet. I don't know. You're complaining about a pothole in your area, and say, okay, we'll get this to the Department of Transportation in that particular instance, and we'll see if we can't get this fixed.
Do you think there's anything unethical or that sets up a conflict of interest if the government is controlling petitions to the government, like what happened under this law?
I think it raises a lot of questions. I think government as an organizer is somewhat a gray area. What role do they play in that? And the fact that they're actually controlling what the threshold is, that's kind of concerning because they could change it at any time, as you saw on the federal level.
Can you see City Council proposing something more appealing or more appropriate? Somebody suggested, YouTube videos like for Kickstarter or something.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of an interesting proposal. I think they're going to have to come to some sort of compromise. I know Councilmember Vaca, I talked to him after the hearing, and he definitely wants this bill passed, so they're going to have to come up with some compromise. It could be those kind of things. It could be having another government agency run this, maybe using the public advocate, giving her some sort of role.
Do you think there's a need in New York City to give more of a platform to people in general to address this in some way, what they're trying to create?
I think so. I think you can't really go wrong by giving people more options to reach out to their government. So, yeah, I think that it definitely could be useful. But that side of me that doesn't like government waste doesn't want to see us just put something online and not do anything with it.
Are there any positive examples of city government using new media or some kind of technology to actually expand public access, if not this one?
I mean, I think you've seen a little bit with Twitter. The government agencies have started to use Twitter a lot more. And so that's kind of been interesting. You see it a lot more with NYPD, and that's kind of government using social media. But I can't think of any other ones off the top of my head.
Where would this story fit into a bigger picture of de Blasio administration transparency?
Well, this is the second bill that kind of deals with, in this kind of realm, like open and transparent. And this is the second bill in which the de Blasio administration has not really been very receptive. This one, they gave a flat-out denial. And the open FOIL bill, they were very lukewarm. They kind of created their own little open FOIL system for City Hall that wasn't very well received. And so
Now, open FOIL, we in journalism know what that means. Explain to the viewers, what is an open FOIL system?
So the FOIL is you can submit a request to
It's an acronym for the Freedom of Information Law,
yes,
right?
Yes. So you can submit one of those to your government, but actually then Public Advocate de Blasio created a report, and he showed that more often than not, these are not being answered, and he rated different agencies with NYPD being the worst. So the City Council created this bill. Councilmember Ben Kalos was actually the sponsor on that, and would create an online platform that would basically show you where your FOIL request was. And the administration was very lukewarm to this. This came out in the spring, and so I think there was a little bit more of a honeymoon period between the council and the administration, and maybe that kind of is passed, and that may be why we're getting like such a hard no.
It's like at the post office or a shipping service. Go online and track your package.
That's right.
Track your Freedom of Information request.
That's correct.
Why don't they want that?
They had their reasons. They thought it was basically I guess to sum up, they thought it was kind of too big of a project to handle all at once, and so they wanted to see. They created their own at City Hall, and they have like a City Hall tracker system, and I guess they're going to see how that works.
So petition NYC once again before you go. Where does it stand? Is it dead, or is it in some kind of negotiation?
I wouldn't call it dead, but there's a lot of daylight between the administration and the council, so there's going to have to be a lot of changes before we see this bill pass.
All right, sounds like we're going to have to find other ways for most New Yorkers to make their voices heard at City Hall. Thank you very much. It's Public Intellectual, where we look at new research with the power to change minds and public policy. Women entrepreneurs account for more than a third of businesses in the United States, but only receive about 1/6 of the funding that venture capital firms invest to help businesses get going. More precisely, 36% of businesses are launched by women, but they receive less than 15% of the venture capital. These numbers can be found in a new report out of Babson College entitled Women Entrepreneurs 2014, Bringing the Gender Gap or Bridging the Gender Gap in Venture Capital. So who exactly is deciding where venture capital goes? And why such a wide differential? Is it simply sexism? How might it be made more equitable? Joining us from Massachusetts via Skype to discuss, the lead author of the report, Candida Brush, Division Chair of Entrepreneurship at Babson College. Hello from New York. Thank you very much for joining us. Please excuse my hoarse voice today.
No problem. It's nice to be on your show. Thank you so much.
What were you studying? What research question were you trying to ask?
So we were interested in knowing how many businesses with a woman on the team had received venture capital. And this is a question we studied first in 1999. And the answer in 1999 was 5% of all U.S. businesses. We decided to replicate that story today and see if things had changed. And of course, we found that yes, it had changed. There was some good news and some not so good news. The good news was 15% of all U.S. businesses funded by venture capital had a woman on the team. But only 2.7% of those businesses had a woman CEO. So that means 97% of all businesses, and again, our sample was over a 3-year period, 2011 to 2014, 2011 to 2013, and out of the more than 6,000 businesses, 97% of those businesses had male CEOs and only 2.7% had a female CEO.
And of businesses receiving venture capital, only 15% were owned by women compared to compared to 36% of all businesses being owned by women. Is that the right number?
No, we're not talking ownership, because once you have venture capital funding, you don't own your business anymore. These are 15% of the businesses had one woman on the executive team.
I see.
Yeah, so 2.7% had a woman CEO. So, and the executive teams are anywhere from 6 to 12 people, depending on the different roles.
So how do you count for the success? How do you count for the limits of the success?
Well, I think the success in part is that, you know, we have a qualified pool of businesses started by women, especially in the biotechnology area and also in software. And so we have a lot of women who have PhDs in engineering or biotechnology, and they have started and launched these businesses and grown them. So now we see some increases in the numbers of women on those executive teams. But there's still some questions that we have based on our findings. For example, most of the businesses that had a woman on the team were older and bigger, and they were receiving later stage investment. So the question is, what's happening in the early stage rounds? Why are there fewer women in receiving early stage investment, and why are there fewer women in some sectors like computer peripherals and telecom and some of these other sectors?
Was there an assumption on the part of anyone, and did you test it, that women are in sectors that are less likely to be going for venture capital?
Actually, that's true if you look at ownership. So if you look at businesses in the United States, there's 29 million businesses in the United States. And for ownership, it's very true that a higher proportion of women are in service and retailing. But when you look at that very top of the pyramid, and again, venture capital funding is less than 0.1% of all U.S. businesses. So it's a very small number of businesses. And so, yes, there might be fewer women in those businesses, but things have changed in the last 20 years. We now have many more women scientists, so the pool has increased. And in fact, if we look at businesses that are looking for what we call angel funding, we see that about 15 to 17% of those businesses have women CEOs. So there is traction in those earlier stages. It's when they get to venture capital, which is where you're going to have the big investments, and the scaling is where we're starting to see some differences.
Do you see out and out sexism coming into play in any of your findings?
Well, we didn't, again, we're looking at data. So it's hard to determine that, because we were just looking at, pure data set. We had a large data set that examined investments. So our data is really the facts. In other words, what investments were made at what time. Anecdotally, we did some interviews, and we did hear some from entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, who said that they felt that there was a bias against women in terms of getting those opportunities to pitch at the same rate as their male counterparts. But that's very anecdotal, so I wouldn't generalize from that.
We've been talking about the women at companies that are applying for venture capital. How about women in the venture capital firms?
Yes, and that's a whole another interesting story, because in 1999, approximately 10% of all the partners in the venture capital industry were female, and today that number has declined to 8.5%. Now, the interesting thing about this is we know that venture capital firms that have a woman on the team are much more likely to invest in businesses with women on their teams. So it's a big high percentage too. It's like 60% more likely. The other thing that's interesting is that those venture capital firms that fund businesses that have women on the teams are more active, they have larger assets under management, and they tend to do more deals per year.
What does pitching to venture capital firms look like? For people who have never touched this world, what's it like?
It's a lot of work. I was in a panel last week, and there was a woman entrepreneur, and she said she had made more than 45 pitches over the course of several years. And so it takes an incredible amount of time. I'm a member of an angel group here in Boston, and we see pitches of much earlier stage businesses. And even the pitches we see are practiced. And that's one thing that entrepreneurs really, if we think about what entrepreneurs can do to be successful in the pitching arena, is they have to practice and they have to be coachable, because you're going to do it a lot of times.
Can you say that men at venture capital firms are less likely to give money to companies with women at their top ranks?
Well, that's what the evidence says. 85% of all businesses funded by venture capital have no women on the teams. So if we're looking at likelihood, that's what the facts say. Now, I think one of the things we discovered after we released this report is an element of surprise in the venture community, that they did not know that the numbers were so low. And so I think part of our research was to at least say this is the landscape. And so if this is the landscape, and it appears to be it is an unequal, sort of proportion of funding that's going to companies with women on the teams, why is that? And so perhaps this is an opportunity for people in the venture business to look at their own portfolio and say how many women are coming to apply for funding, and how many women are actually being considered in going through the due diligence process.
Do the results hold up across sectors, similarly in, say, retail or tech or food?
Well, the two sectors where you have the most funding of businesses with women is biotechnology and software. Foods and some of those sectors are much lower. Even consumer products is lower. Business products is slightly higher. But again, it's such a small percentage. I think part of the explanation for the women in biotechnology and healthcare is approximately a high percentage of women are getting their medical degrees and studying in the biological sciences. And so that suggests that they have the advanced degrees to create innovations in those sectors. On the other hand, if you look at the percentages of women in engineering schools, I think it's somewhere around 15%. So that would explain fewer women in computer peripherals and technology.
Right. And you wrote in the Wall Street Journal, I see, about updating the textbooks to teach more about women entrepreneurs. Do we still need to send the message to girls and young women studying as if it was 50 years ago that you are allowed to do anything?
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon, but part of it I think is role modeling, in that I teach in a business school. I've taught at 3 different business schools, and if you look at the cases that we have in our undergraduate and MBA programs, the predominant the protagonist is almost always a male, and we need to show women in those female roles. So part of it's case writing, part of it is creating, visibility for those role models of successful women entrepreneurs so that everybody can understand that anybody can be a successful entrepreneur.
Are women just less interested in entrepreneurship because of a values question, perhaps, that sometimes it's seen as making money for making money's sake, and maybe men are more interested in that because it's a game?
Well, I've done some other work on that, actually. We've looked at, part of the research we've done here at Babson is through the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, which is a 79-country study of all businesses around the, of entrepreneurs around the world. And we capture nascent entrepreneurs and we capture attitudes. And the attitudes and motivations are pretty similar for men and women in the United States and in a lot of other countries, except for the fact that women tend to have a higher fear of failure. That fear of failure is inversely related to the economic development of the country. And so, in other words, if I'm in a very highly developed nation like the United States, I have more to lose if I start a business. Now, so it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. That's a different research study. We're looking at some different kinds of things. But the motivations for men and women are pretty much the same: achievement, independence, desire to do something on their own, and desire not to work for somebody else.
So could you say, and we have 30 seconds, that if there's a higher percentage of women getting venture capital grants than there is today, that it would be good for the overall U.S. economy?
Absolutely. Because if we're only investing in one population of entrepreneurs, how do we know that those other populations don't have good innovations to be commercialized? And that's the thing. As an economy, we want to commercialize and fund and scale the best innovations that we possibly can, the best technologies to solve problems that we all face in our environment. So it has to be strategic. In other words, it's like diversity. You have to do it intentionally. And I think intentionally reaching out into new networks to look for new opportunities is a chance for all sorts of businesses to succeed and a chance for investors to make money.
Really interesting. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your research.
Thank you so much, Brian. It was a pleasure. Have a great day.
And that's Public Intellectual. I'm Brian Lehrer. Up next, preserving in photos the murals of East Harlem. Across New York City's 5 boroughs, neighborhood murals have long illuminated exterior walls, reflecting the culture, history, and values of the surrounding community. They are painted by children, professional artists, and everyone in between. But as gentrification sweeps the city, many murals, which have stood like flags of the neighborhoods they adorn, have come down. Community activist Marina Ortiz has been photographing East Harlem's murals, giving us a record of the ones that have survived for now and those that have been lost. Her collection, titled Lost and Found Murals of East Harlem, is on display at East Harlem Cafe, that's at 104th and Lex, with a closing event on October 17th. Ortiz is the founder of East Harlem Preservation. She joins us now. Welcome to the program. So let's start right in with an image.
Sure.
Let's put this up on the screen and tell us what we're looking at.
This is a mural on 105th off 3rd Avenue called Dos Alas, which means 2 wings in Spanish. And it's honoring Don Pedro Avicio Campos, who is he's the father of Puerto Rican nationalists and Puerto Rican independence, and Che Guevara, who was Cuban leader. And it's called Dos Alas, which comes from a phrase in a poem written by a woman, Lola Rodriguez de Tio. She wrote the Puerto Rican's national anthem, and it talks about Cuba and Puerto Rico around the time of the Spanish-American War.
Dos Alas translates as 2 wings.
Yeah, the phrase is Puerto Rico and Cuba, 2 wings of the same bird.
Only one of those faces is on T-shirts all over the world and one isn't, right?
Well, if you go to East Harlem, you will see Don Pedro's face on some
Yes.
T-shirts as well, absolutely.
Okay. Let's go to, well, tell us about her.
This is during 2011. I was part of a restoration campaign, and the mural was actually originally painted in 1999 and was very badly faded. So a few of us came together and restored the mural with some of the original artists. And that's a local resident who just stood there looking at the work, and I captured the mural through her sunglasses. And this is one of our team members, Zen Medina. He was part of the restoration crew and also, I believe, part of the original project as well.
How common is it for, and we'll see many more murals, but how commonly are they overtly political, explicitly political like that?
In East Harlem, that is part of the history of community art. It's very political. The series that you're looking at is actually part of 10 murals that were created around 1999 to 2000 that were specifically addressing Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican independence, and gentrification in East Harlem. And that's the only one that's left. The rest have been either painted over or destroyed because they were put up on fences or buildings that have been since torn down to make way for luxury developments.
Let's see, is this guy happy or not happy about the two wings?
During the restoration, we engaged community residents, and we did poetry readings, music performances, had conversations with our neighbors, and his issue was actually, why are you also depicting Che Guevara? He could see that Don Pedro Albizu Campos had he could get the connection to him in the Puerto Rican community, but he wasn't sure why we had Che Guevara up there on the wall.
I can see where that could be a common reaction, right? It's a Puerto Rican community.
Sure.
Why do we have to link ourselves to Che Guevara necessarily?
Well, the thought behind the mural, and again, Dos Salas, is about the connection to between the Puerto Rican and Cuban independence movement, and there actually were quite a number of exiles, not just from Puerto Rico, but from Cuba, who lived in New York and in East Harlem during the early part of the 20th century. So there is that connection.
Let's see another mural.
Sure.
And this one also has two individuals, the political prisoners, Oscar Lopez Rivera and Avelina Gonzalez.
Absolutely, yes. This is on 104th Street between 3rd Avenue and Lexington Avenue. And this was created about 4 or 5 years ago. There's Oscar's image on the left. Actually, both of their images have since been vandalized. I don't know if you have that slide on there. But this is, this photo was taken during a cultural event. What we do in East Harlem is we not only create murals, but we create cultural spaces so that these works of art become places where we celebrate historical events, birthdays, memorials. So we'll perform music, poetry, and that's what we were doing there that day when those children were in front.
And we will see an example later of a vandalized mural. We don't have it with that one.
Sure.
But what was their story a little bit?
Well, they're both Puerto Rican political prisoners. Oscar Lopez Rivera is actually the oldest Puerto Rican political prisoner in jail. We've been petitioning.
Where?
He's in a federal maximum security prison in the Midwest, and we've actually been petitioning President Obama for his release. He's 72 years old, and he's been in prison over 33 years for the crime of sedition, which is not an actual crime. He wasn't convicted of any violent act or anything, and he was part of a number of Puerto Ricans who served, who were arrested. 19 of them were granted clemency by President Clinton in 1999, and he refused out of principle for several reasons, but we've been campaigning for his release. And so the mural is in his honor, and also Avelino Gonzalez.
Next mural.
Sure. This is on 115th Street off of First Avenue. It's part of a longer piece that stretches, like 40 feet. They were created by artists who are part of the Camaradas El Barrio crew, which is an awesome cultural spot around the corner on First Avenue. And I think the name of the mural is There Is a Rose, which is quite appropriate for El Barrio, Spanish Harlem.
And are we looking at an actual person in front of the mural, or is that image part of the mural?
That's a passerby, yeah, yeah. I tried to capture not just the works of art, but local residents either engaged in the renovations or enjoying or as part of the scenery, yeah. And this is on the same wall a few years ago, the same group of artists created this collage, and I believe that's Angela Davis in the background there.
Depicted.
Yeah.
Okay, let's keep going.
This was a mural on 110th Street that was commissioned by Art for Change, which is a local nonprofit organization, between 3rd Avenue and Lexington Avenue, and it was painted over by the property owner within months.
Let's pause for a minute from looking at some of the murals. We have
Sure.
a lot more that we can show you in a few minutes, and we will. It's the lost and found murals. It's the existing ones. It's the ones that have been destroyed. Is there protection for these murals of any kind?
Not really. It depends on where they are and what kind of property and who the property owner is. There are some that are in parks, so that would be up to the city, I guess. Most of the murals in East Harlem have been painted on tenement walls, and there are good landlords like Hope Community who have been very supportive of commissioning the arts and protecting them. But in terms of maintenance and funding, that's always an issue.
Excuse me. And
Sure.
does it run the gamut, the images in this collection, between things that were commissioned for a particular space to things that were illegally placed on those spaces against the will of the owners or the residents?
Well, we call it more like without permission. So even, the Dos Alas mural was created without permission, but has since become a, people really do appreciate it. The property owner was very supportive when we restored it. And by the way, I wasn't part of the original creation, but I was instrumental in the restoration. And the property owner was extremely supportive.
So you create murals as well as document them?
Well, I'm not an artist per se. I do the photography, but I did organize the restoration, bring in the artists and help get the word out, document the whole activity and everything.
Of course, there was just this big controversy at 5 Points in Queens about street art that was part of the community, and then it was taken down by the new owner of a new development on the site. Are there any formal protections that you're seeking that don't exist for some of this art in East Harlem?
Not that I am personally. I know the Graffiti Hall of Fame on 106th Street and Park Avenue is also protected because there's a good relationship with the Department of Education. It's a part of a schoolyard. There's a mural by Keith Haring in a public park, Crack is Whack mural, which is protected and well maintained by the foundation. Unfortunately, not very many people can see it because it's so isolated. So again, it depends on whose property it is.
And I think we'll get to that Crack is Whack, very famous mural in the sequence as we continue to go through some of these images. So let's see what's next.
This is a mural that Hope Community commissioned. It's up on one of their walls on Lexington Avenue between 124th and 123rd Street. And it was done with local students and arts organizations. And it's called Which Path Will You Take? So it shows the choices that young people can make in life, whether to pursue an education and a job and I guess ultimately a family. And then at the top, different careers, whether it's in entertainment or civil service. And then the other side being drugs and violence and the possibility of jail or worse.
Follow the yellow brick road.
Right.
Is this still intact?
Unfortunately, the bottom section was painted over by, I believe, the property owner, and I'm not sure why.
Too bad, especially with a positive pro-social message like that.
Absolutely. This is another Hope Community mural. It's part of a bigger piece that deals with immigration. It was created by students. Esperanza del Barrio was an organization that partnered with Hope Community. And so we see Lady Liberty here drowning, maybe. So it's addressing, I guess, the issue of, rights in this country, immigrant rights. And this is another mural on 115th Street, also created by students. And I guess,
It's gorgeous.
yeah,
Look at
it's
all of
beautiful. Yeah.
that. The cityscape with the buildings around it and
Yeah.
the tree and so much humanity there along the surface. All right, next one.
This is a mural that was created by James de la Vega, who used this wall for quite a number of murals that he created depending on what was happening in the news and what inspired him. So this was having to do with one of the earlier hostage situations in Iraq. And this was the gate to his studio storefront, his gallery storefront. And I guess he endorsed Fernando Ferrer for mayor back in
guess
2005. Yeah.
Vote 2005. People remember Fernando Ferrer was the Democratic candidate for mayor against Michael Bloomberg.
Yes, a historic run. And this is just around the corner on 104th Street off of Lexington Avenue, honoring Puerto Rican reggaeton rapper, musician, Tego Calderon.
Looks like something from the 70s, doesn't it? And yet reggaeton is a more recent phenomenon.
Yes, yeah, and it's still happening, yeah.
How strong is the connection of East Harlem and Puerto Rican New York to current day Puerto Rico itself, speaking artistically or any other way?
It's still very strong. There were a number of artists who came in from Puerto Rico to do another series last year, 2013, called Los Muros Hablan, which means murals speak. And there were 5 murals that were painted around East Harlem by these artists. They partnered with another artist from Brooklyn. So and our community goes back and forth all the time. So there still is very much a connection, absolutely.
Next slide. Who could mistake a little religious reference here?
This is a mural by a local resident and artist, director George Zavala. And he's got the Puerto Rican flag in there. And Juan Bautista honoring a religious figure.
How long has this been here, do you know?
That was, it's actually been removed, and he says he's going to restore it. He removed it himself in this case.
Uh-huh.
And
Where is he now? Is he still working in the neighborhood?
Yeah, he lives and works in the neighborhood. And he was part of the Dos Alas restoration as well. This is the Spirit of East Harlem, the 4-story mural we saw earlier when it was vandalized in 2007. And I was part of the team that helped restore it. I brought in Manny Vega, who you see there, who was the artist who also helped restore it with Hank Pressing in the early 80s. So he worked on the mural in 2007. And he has a way of working where he engages the community. So there were, again, a lot of conversations going on during the work.
I don't know if we can go back. Oh, and there it is. Completed.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Beautiful shot. Beautiful mural. I don't know if we can go back 2 slides and see this vandalized. It's sort of street art over street art.
Well, you know, we had a panel discussion about that because there is a difference between not just the kind of art, whether it's graffiti or murals, but also the community itself. And there's always been in agreement that you don't tag community murals. So, you can do that in the graffiti movement, but you don't necessarily. So this was really shocking to a lot of people, and local residents who lived on the street were really outraged. And it's just something that's not done.
So going forward through again,
And it hasn't been done since.
because of community response, probably.
Yeah, yeah.
Next.
This is a mosaic that Hope Community commissioned, and I also was a part of that project. This was actually created on a wall that James de la Vega used to paint on, and one of his murals was painted over, and so I went to Hope Community and I said, "Oh no, what did you do? You have to really make up for this and do it in a big way." And at that time, we were petitioning to have 106th Street, where this is located, named in honor of Julia de Burgos, who is a Puerto Rican poet. So I said, well, let's do a mural of Julia de Burgos. And local residents convinced me, let's do something more permanent, let's do a mosaic, and let's bring Manny Vega in.
Great representations today of the murals of East Harlem. Where can people see this again?
Well, they are all over. The exhibition is at the East Harlem Cafe on 104th Street and Lexington Avenue, and it'll be up till October 18th. We're having the closing reception on Friday, October 17th.
Thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Great. Thank you for having me, Brian.
And that's our program for today. We're here every week at this hour with a new show. Next time, Decoding the Chinese Internet, and Archtober, a glimpse at the month-long celebration of architecture and design in New York City. And consider tuning into my radio program as well, weekday mornings at 10 a.m. on WNYC, 93.9 FM and AM 820. Tomorrow in our series, 25 Years in 25 Days, what do you remember from 1997? It's Brian Lehrer on WNYC tomorrow morning. Thanks for watching tonight.